Hello, and welcome to Master or Disaterpiece, a series where I, Akash, unqualified teenage girl on the internet, talks about items in the literary canon, classics, and gives my opinion on them. Today's episode is about 1984 by George Orwell, so let's get into it. 1984 by George Orwell. You love it, you hate it, you've read it or pretended to, so you seemed cool and deep. You have at the very least heard about it, but why?
Okay, yeah, no, that was incorrect. That was very incorrect. I'm gonna be honest. When I had the question, my intro was originally gonna be, oh, have you heard of 1984? And then I was gonna say, have you read 1984? And I thought that was gonna go a lot like this. Have you ever heard of 1984 or George Orwell?
Yeah, of course.
Have you ever read 1984?
No.
Okay. But that's not really how most of my interviews went, at least not at first. After one very enlightening question.
Who's that?
Okay, so that's a no.
Nah. Who's that though?
George Orwell, he wrote Animal Farm.
Wait. You've heard of him. Hold on. This guy.
I realized that I got better results of people knowing George Orwell if I mentioned Animal Farm instead of 1984. I ended up asking a total of 15 people in my philosophy class, 12 people in my English class, and 8 different teachers. In my philosophy class, there were 6 people who knew about George Orwell in 1984, but when I mentioned Animal Farm, that number jumped up to 10 people. In my English class, I asked 12 people. Only 3 of them had actually heard of George Orwell. From my philosophy class, only 2 people had actually read it, and in my English class, no one had. Out of all the teachers I asked, 5 teachers had actually read it. "1984" by George Orwell probably doesn't need an introduction. This is largely due to the fact that it is part of a collection of works called the literary canon. Basically, a bunch of dead white guys wrote things deemed as classics. But why do some books have the right to be canon and others don't? Why is 1984 in the canon, and does it deserve to be? When I was a child, my father told me to read 1984 and give an essay on it. It was the first book from the canon that I ever read. However, when I was a child, I had terrible penmanship, and grammar, and spelling, and cognitive function. So my father allowed me to give the essay orally. And I don't remember the points of my essay, but I do remember that I had an overall positive view of the book. I thought it was genius, a masterpiece. I've revisited 1984, taken off my rose-colored glasses and thinking of it not as a novel I thought was amazing as a child, and instead thinking of it as just a novel. How did this new lens disregarding nostalgia affect my opinions of the book? Let's dive into an objective overview of 1984. Before we talk about my opinions on the novel and what the message of the novel is, we first need to make sure that we're on the same page about what the novel is. Whether you were forced to read it in English class or you've seen the infamous Big Brother is watching you image online somewhere, you've experienced 1984 in some sense. Probably. But just to make sure, let's go over a quick summary of everything that happens. The base premise of 1984 is this. A place called Oceania is controlled by a government system referred to as the Party. The figurehead of this organization is known as Big Brother. Oh, wait, not that one. A man named Winston Smith is against the Party. The book follows him and a girl named Julia as they commit small acts of rebellion, illegal practices. They are eventually caught and the Party tortures them in an attempt to make them hate each other. They succeed. Winston loves Big Brother now, then he dies. The end. In order to understand this video, I only need to go into 4 main things. 1. What is Oceania like? 2. What does the Party do? 3. What is the Brotherhood? And 4. Who are our characters? Oceania used to be at war with Eurasia, but is now at war with Wait. No. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia. East Asia was always the enemy. Miniature says we have always been at war with East Asia. If you remember otherwise, you need to be re-educated. You need to check again. Go, check again. We have always been at war with East
In Oceania, citizens are monitored very, very closely. There are devices everywhere called telescreens. Telescreens are two-way screens. They are always transmitting news and other important information that citizens need to know. But also, they serve as cameras. The party can listen in to any telescreen at any given moment. This is to help them make sure that citizens do not commit illegal acts.
In Oceania, basically everything is a crime. Creativity is illegal. Individuality is illegal. Sex is illegal. Humanity, essentially, is illegal. The worst of all crimes are thought crimes. Essentially, having any differing opinions about Oceania or the party or Big Brother.
What I'm getting at is the party is just oh so great, and we have wonderful things like the daily minutes of hate to remind you that people that go against Big Brother are so vile. Anyway, the next important thing, how does the party go about making sure that people don't commit these evil, horrid crimes?
The party keeps order, and by order I of course mean control, through the help of the four ministries. They have the Ministry of Truth, the Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Love, and the Ministry of Plenty. I'll go into all of them individually. First up is the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True in Newspeak.
It's editing Akash from the future here again. Just real quick, I didn't go into like a whole tangent about it because it's not really relevant to my review, but I just need to get out how frustrating the idea of Newspeak is to me. Like, essentially what happens is a lot of things in Newspeak have been shortened because it's like abbreviations or whatever. So instead of saying the Ministry of Truth, you say Mini-True, and there's stuff like that. And none of it makes any sense. Like, Newspeak does not need to exist. Like, it's not like a whole thing. If you're calling the Ministry of Truth Mini-True, that's not a new language. And it's like, I know that it's like called Newspeak because they do this for everything, but why? What does the party like achieve by making people talk less? What is like, huh?
Mini-True, or the Ministry of Truth, is meant to control the news, but really what it does is manipulates information and history. Then we have the Ministry of Peace, or Mini-Pax. It's the ministry that's involved with the war efforts. Next is the Ministry of Love, or Mini-Love, which is supposed to keep order and law, but is really about suppressing and torturing those involved with politics. And then the Ministry of Plenty, or Mini-Plenty, is meant to be responsible for economic affairs, but is more in charge of rationing and withholding supplies. Through these four ministries, the party has control over every aspect of Oceania. They monitor and they punish.
There isn't too much to say about the Brotherhood in general. Basically, it is this rumored organization that is against Big Brother and the party, but obviously being a part of the Brotherhood is extremely illegal, so members can't really just say that they're in the Brotherhood. It's more secretive, and that's why you suspect people of being part of the Brotherhood, and that's where some of the stuff happens, which I'll get into when I explain the next part, the characters.
The three main characters are Winston, Julia, and O'Brien. Winston Smith is our protagonist. He is a young, free thinker who plays by his own rules and thinks society can change for the better. A very unique archetype that we totally haven't seen in every single novel. He works at Mini-True, and he's unhappy with the party. He starts the book by buying a diary, which is illegal, and writing down with Big Brother and other such illegal thoughts. He meets a girl named Julia, and they begin to have an affair, which is also illegal. Winston, the face of feminism, first mentions Julia as a dark-haired co-worker who he hates.
I mean, it's really no wonder that Winston was against the corrupt government. I mean, you can tell that he had a lot of progressive views and cared about the equality of people. I'll read to you an actual quote from the book. This happens on page 12. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the woman, and above all, the young ones. This man was advocator for rights, truly. He did not align with Big Brother's views at all. What a man.
Winston aside, we have our next main character, his love interest, Julia. Julia is a distant co-worker. She also works for Mini-True, but in a different department, and we believe that she does something mechanical. And
By her wondrous red sash, we know that she is a member of the Anti-Sex League. However, she does not actually believe in it. She has illegal thoughts against the party just like Winston and engages in the outlawed act of sex. Her and Winston begin the relationship when Julia passes him a note. The affairs start from there. Julia is actually a really intelligent and honestly a much more likable character than Winston. She also cares about liberation more and with much less fear than Winston. Winston just writes in a diary and fantasizes about his soulmate secretly being, he suspects that O'Brien is part of the Brotherhood. O'Brien is a member of the Inner Party, which means that outer party workers like Winston and Julia don't know the entirety of what they do at work. O'Brien is, at least through Winston's eyes, a charming man that seems trustworthy. This is completely wrong.
Basically, Winston thinks that O'Brien is secretly part of the Brotherhood and against the party. And things happen throughout the book that make him more sure of this. And O'Brien starts giving him, books about, the Brotherhood and rebellion. And Winston falls for it, but it turns out the entire time O'Brien was just trying to get evidence of him and Julia doing, illegal things because he suspected them of being vile traitors. And then he tortures them. And he straps a cage of rats to Winston's face. So Winston really just has great intuition on this one, women suck, especially Julia. They probably are just so complicit with the party. But O'Brien's so cool. What a guy. I can't make this up. Literally the first introductions of Julia, who's the love interest of the book, who's supposed to be a main character, and O'Brien, who's the main villain of the book, but we don't think he's the villain at first, I guess, is he spends 3 lines talking about Julia and women and how much he hates them. And then he spends a page and a half being O'Brien, what a guy, so cool. What?
And then stepping outside the events in the book, Orwell actually wrote the novel based very, very heavily on Joseph Stalin and communism. He wrote this in the 1940s, and he didn't change much. He didn't even get a new name. He just slapped Stalin on a poster and once, I guess we'll call him Big Brother or something. Orwell is the author of another book, Animal Farm, which also carries themes of corrupt society. So 1984 is not that much of a shock. Orwell was dissatisfied with the world he lived in, and he conveyed his anger through novels.
So, to recap this all, the book follows Winston as he tries to get in contact with the Brotherhood to turn up against his corrupt society. However, his crimes eventually catch up to him. He's made to embrace the love of Big Brother, and he betrays his love interest Julia. Now, how does this classic literary masterpiece hold up? What do qualified critics have to say about it? What do we get from analyzing this book? And lastly, how does this fit into this golden standard of literature called the canon? Say some prayers for the dead horse because it's time for yet another beating.
Now that we all know what this book is about, let's dive further into what it's really about. I'm going to give an objective analysis of the themes in this book. Let's start by picking apart the message of this book. The themes of classism and oppression are very apparent, but how specifically is this message conveyed? I'm going to explain 1984 using something called the Marcus theory.
My original notes on the Marcus theory highlight the importance of class, status, and power. It asks the question of who decides which things are valued more, and what privilege gets you to decide those things.
To clarify, Marcus theory is a lens of viewing something. To apply Marcus theory to something, it means looking at whatever you're considering while considering the themes of class, status, labor, and other key factors. So what do we get from 1984 when we put on our Marcus glasses? In 1984, there are regular blue overall workers and members of the Inner Party, who wear black overalls. The party is the key class divide. In our society, your class is determined by your financial bracket. The cutoff point of class in 1984 is about your distance to Big Brother. The value of your class is very apparent in the novel. A member of the Inner Party has more rights than the outer workers. Early on, Winston purchases a diary from Mr. Charrington. We find out later that Mr. Charrington is actually with the Thought Police.
As a member of the inner party, Mr. Charrington has access to a diary. He can hold illegal contraband that would get a regular blue overall worker detained.
Let's come back to reality for a second. In real life, we don't have overalls, but we do have some things called blue-collar workers and white-collar workers.
In case you're unfamiliar with the terms, a blue-collar job is typically something that includes physical labor, and it's different to white-collar jobs, which are office or administrative or management positions. Blue and white-collar workers are viewed very, very differently, and people don't even realize how differently they view them.
A little bit ago at our school, we had a showing of universities, colleges, skilled trades, stuff like that. And it was divided mainly into two different rooms. There was Gymnasium A, which had colleges, skilled trades, apprentices, stuff like that. And then the other room had stuff for universities. And when we walked into the first room, I was with my friend, and she made some joke about this being the room for people with no futures. And it felt weird to hear that about a room that I wanted to be in and I spent more time looking in, considering my job, dream job, is to become an electrician. And I know that you might think of it as a harmless joke, but that's exactly what I'm trying to talk about. The fact that it's so normal to value white-collar jobs over blue-collar jobs is due to society pushing this idea that they're better.
In 1984, this concept carries over with the blue overall workers aspiring to be like black overall workers, aka white-collar workers. They have a job deemed as more productive, largely related to the distance of the job to the higher-ups. While, yes, we do not associate white-collar workers with the government as much as we link black overall workers with the party, but there's still this unconscious link. We see someone that works at a large company closer to the government than you would a humble plumber. More innately view jobs that are higher up the corporate ladder as more refined, and they see it as a goal to climb that ladder as much as possible. This ties into the next component of power.
In 1984, everything is controlled by the party, but Big Brother watching you isn't enough. Action also needs to be taken. This action can be taken by inner party members or regular citizens. Inner party members, like O'Brien, for example, do important work, and regular citizens don't know the full extent of everything they do, but they're aware that it's something big. Those in power stay in power. It is very difficult to fall from being a party member unless you betray Big Brother. Power is awarded, but not to those that put in the work. The last component I'm going to mention is labor. While those in positions of power do have objectives, it's not the same as blue-collar workers. Blue overall workers or blue-collar workers are just cogs in the machine. Winston himself has to alter records in miniature for the sake of the party. He has to give his life to a cause that he doesn't believe in, because those with power require his labor. 1984 is rooted entirely in the concepts of just and Marcus theory. Everything surrounds class.
Remember what I said at the start of this video? 1984 is a part of something called the canon. I'm gonna explain a bit more about how 1984 connects to it. I'm also going to explain another dystopian novel, one that is not in the canon. First, let's talk about what the canon actually is. Basically, it's a collection of works deemed as timeless masterpieces. You've heard about a lot of them, from Animal Farm to Moby Dick to Handmaid's Tale to Kill a Mockingbird. There's a ton of these. Books in the canon are supposed to be books with deeper messages, beautifully written, and they remain relevant throughout time. One of those books is 1984. I have a lot to say about the canon, but I'm really trying to cut down time, so let's just talk about what 1984 specifically reveals about the canon. Its existence in the canon basically reinforces the themes in the novel. The fact is, the story being so widespread is the result of a privileged white man picking up a pen. The canon is a collection of peak, apparently. It's funny that a novel that makes it seem ridiculous that thinking is a crime became a standard. The canon is an outline of the right way of writing, thinking, the best way. The party in 1984 is almost like what the canon is in real life. It is the box you're meant to fit into, a ruling that punishes otherness. Unreasonable censorship is not fiction. Look for a second at the platform you're on. Have you ever heard creators talk about stuff they can't say if they want to be monetized? 1984 is played up with insane surveillance technology and outlawing certain thoughts, but let's take a look at what similarities there are actually with a 1984 and real life. Corrupt government? Check. Inaccurate historical records to change the image of an organization? Check. Unreasonable censorship? Check. Political suppression of those that are other? Check. And the list goes on. The canon is a collection of works that have bypassed the censorship by separating themselves from reality with some sort of extreme. 1984 wants you to conform to the will of Big Brother. But isn't the canon just what writers should strive to conform to?
I just feel very strongly that it's a little ironic that 1984 is in the canon. The canon is slowly phasing out of education, and a lot of the canon used to be mandated reading in schools, but in modern days, more books have been used in classes. However, it still remains that when you ask someone for an example of a good book or a masterpiece, they're most likely to say something from the canon. The canon is a blueprint you're meant to follow, just like the party. While the importance of the canon is diminishing, many still look to the classics as inspiration. Throughout the canon, there are very few female authors, and even less colored authors. The others are not present.
The suppression is similar to the oppression instilled by the canon itself. Books in the canon aren't the greatest things written, they were the greatest things written by those that had the means and privilege to get visibility. Minitree doesn't tell you what happened, it tells you the commercial version of history. So let's talk about something that isn't in the canon. I have been reading Washington Black, which is not in the canon. Washington Black also has themes of power and oppression. It is about a slave meeting a white man that is secretly an advocate for black rights and wants to abolish slavery. So if Washington Black is such a profound analysis of power discrepancies and about the power of the rich ruling class, how come it isn't in the canon while 1984 is? The fact of the matter is, the canon isn't the greatest things written, it's the greatest things written according to the privileged. Books in the canon are normally meant to be really insightful. They have messages, they say something about society or life. Ironically, the canon is almost meta. It upholds the issues talked about within those works. Those in power stay in power. The canon, which mainly consists of novels written by white male authors with a couple women or colored authors thrown in the list for diversity purposes, is chosen and spread by people that already have reach. They fall into the category of privileged, and they preach about the greatness of books that they know, and they're more likely to know a book written by another privileged. And it has this cycle that makes it really difficult for anything written by an other to make it into circulation. Not impossible, of course. The canon features books written by women or people of color, but the ratio of cishet white men versus literally anything else is insane. Washington Black is a novel written by a black woman, and it is critically acclaimed, but it is not the standard of canon books. Most deep and profound books in the canon are fantastical, like 1984. It is dramatized, exaggerated, far past reality. This makes it easier to digest. Thinking about something as a potential or a metaphor allows more people to understand the themes. When a novel is simply reality, people don't get it as easily. It's like the messages need to be highlighted in bright colors in order for people to really understand it. When they just see real experiences, they don't pick out the themes as much because all they see is reality. Canon books are dystopia, fiction, speculation. Washington Black is history. While, yes, Wash himself was not a real person, everything that happened, all the oppression and corruption, it's just history to us. It's not a profound statement or analysis, it's facts. That's why books like 1984 make it into the canon, but books like Washington Black don't. When it gets too real, it's not as palatable.
One of the smaller names in the canon is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is also historical fiction about an ex-slave, but it isn't just history. There's a ghosts and hauntings and names that don't make sense. The themes are amplified through fictional elements, which is why it's allowed to be in the canon. The canon is based on the privileged praising books that have deep messages, normally about the others, while not allowing those they deem others to make it onto the canon if it has any sort of realistic negative views of the privileged. They want you to be insightful until it makes them look bad. You need to dress it up as fiction if you want your message to not be suppressed at the back of the shelf. So, what's my goal with all of this? What am I trying to accomplish? I'm not saying that every book in the canon is terrible and should be replaced by things like Washington Black. I just want you to be aware of how the canon is actually formed and what books make the cuts and which ones don't. Okay, I do not want to be a hater. I do have some positive things to say about 1984. I really enjoyed it when I was a child. But then I stopped being a child and realized that there was a bunch of things that could have been done better. And you might think that some teenage girl on YouTube does not have the credentials to talk about this masterpiece, which, fair enough. So let's look at some opinions that weren't made by a teenage girl, starting with a positive view. The main praise given for 1984 is A, it remains relevant throughout the years, and B, it is a profound statement about corrupt society. Let's look at an article I found that sung the praises of 1984. To summarize this specific article, the writer essentially says, the book is realistic and told in a way that's chilling. The book helps people realize deep-rooted issues in society that are typically ignored. Society and government is cyclical. We don't move away from dystopia, it comes in waves. 1984 is completely timeless, and because of the broadness of the world, it can be applied to current issues. The article says Orwell has come to be regarded as a modern oracle, a gifted soothsayer who predicted with terrifying accuracy how fragile and fallible our political systems were. Which is, of course, very high praise, but is it deserved? 1984 is regarded as a chilling dystopia that reveals a lot about our society. The book is a relevant statement about political corruption. Oceania was never some far-fetched dystopian land set in an unforeseeable future, is written in 1984 glazing the article. But is that really praise? See, yes, 1984 is eerily relevant, but this isn't because Orwell was able to see society deeply for what it truly was. He was retelling events that happened. 1984 is still relevant today, I will give it that, but it is not the result of 1984 being a timeless criticism. It's relevant because we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I'm not trying to say that 1984 has no good qualities. I agree with the article that it remains relevant. However, I don't think 1984 is everything that it's said to be. It's important to think of 1984 in two different regards, thinking of it as both a novel and as a statement. The aforementioned article really talks about it as a political statement and doesn't say much about the actual writing, so that's what I'll focus on for my analysis of this article. There is a lot more to being a good political statement than just giving a stance. I feel 1984 lacks any depth, which makes it not a very effective statement. 1984 is very unimaginative. Let's look at Orwell's lived experiences to explain what I mean. Orwell was a socialist fighting in Spain during the 1930s. He fled back to Britain out of fear for his life. He later attempted to join the British military during World War II, but was rejected and then took to writing. He finished Animal Farm in 1944 and published 1984 in 1949. 1940s. What was going on during that time? Oh, right. Let's look at the deep, nuanced message of 1984 and let's look at history, the history Orwell experienced. There is a mustached man who is associated with the political and societal reform. There's a party that controls society very, very strictly. And the party takes extreme measures to silence those that go against the goals. And there was a war going on, and there was complicated information about the war being given to the public, and a lot of this sounds familiar. Now, obviously, I get that part of his statement is going to be rooted in reality. I mean, you can't talk about something that's so distanced from our world that it's not relevant anymore. But 1984 wasn't a statement on political systems, it was textbook. The book was essentially a retelling of reality without a strong stance actually being made. There were not really strong statements about what society like this means and the implications. There was no notion of better political systems. There was just the world as it was. There's a book series called Unwind, which is not meant to be as political as 1984, but makes a better stance. Instead of us learning about the world as it is, we learn about how it came to be like it and what that means. The views on the system are very clearly established, and there are actions taken against it that make sense and are rooted in political reality. 1984 fails to give us any layers. All it does is let us know that Stalin, Big Brother, wants us to be sane. I think that, unfortunately, we as a society are a little bit brain dead. Having the large over-exaggeration makes it easier for people to see the issues with hyper-controlling government, but that's it. It's a book that only helps to make the politically unaware understand what most people already know. Really a book that should be seen as revolutionary?
The second article is more critical, and it also focuses more on the other aspect of 1984. How does it hold up as a novel? The article essentially says the following. The book is not written in a way that's very interesting. The world building is weak and unimaginative with contradictions. The book is hyped up for seeming to be a deep commentary but has many holes when you sit down to think about it. The article critiques the structure of the book by looking at the world and the actual writing.
The first issue with the world is that the science fiction is very lacking. It does not feel futuristic, and I know that this was written in the 1940s, okay, but I struggle to remember that 1984 is supposed to be sci-fi half the time, because Orwell was just unable to imagine technological advancements that were interesting or realistic. I'm going to read some specifics from the article. Orwell lacks the capacity to see or invent small changes. His hero finds it difficult in his world of 1984 to get shoelaces or razor blades. So would I, in the real world of the 1980s, for so many people use slip-on shoes and electric razors. And then another part says, Orwell was unable to conceive of computers or robots, or he would have placed everyone under non-human surveillance. Our own computers to some extent do this in the IRS, in credit files, and so on. So, to recap, the world was made lazily. There were minor details that were not thought out. The system of reporting, for example, does not make sense. It does not hold up that well, and in our society, it probably would not work that effectively. And the surveillance technology is meant to be extremely advanced, but it feels nothing like that. And it's also unnecessary. The telescreens could be separate cameras and constant screens, and it would change literally nothing. And as a sci-fi lover, I don't like to consider 1984 sci-fi. Honestly, the article captures a lot of the complaints that I had with it. So, I don't have that much to say in response to it, honestly. I think that Orwell wrote history slightly amplified, without considering any details. The lack of thought results in questions being asked. You may think, 1984 was a political book first, sci-fi secondary, which leads in very well to the next main point.
The writing of 1984 is reliant on crutches. A lot of the problems in this book are explained by the book. Boring characters are the result of assimilation. Inconsistencies are the result of corruption of the system. Unrealistic society is just dystopia. Everything is given a fallback. The article also has issues with the pacing and characterization. I agree with some parts of this and others I don't. Before we get into characters, let's talk about the interesting writing choices. I agree with the article saying that there were repetitive scenes and some pacing was a bit off. Things like Winston reading to Julia did not need to happen at all, and it is a little annoying how often they re-emphasize things. The writing is not very interesting. The climax of the book has a scene where Winston has a cage of rats strapped to his face. He's so scared he betrays Julia by asking they do it to her instead of him. I will read to you the emotional turning point, what the whole book led to. I will read it with as much emotion as I possibly can, but I will not change a single word. To further help you enter the headscape, look at these images of rats and afraid men. The mask was closing on his face. The wire brushed his cheek, and then, no, it was not relief, only hope. A tiny fragment of hope. Too late, perhaps too late, but he had suddenly understood that in the whole world there was just one person to whom he could transfer his punishment, one body that he could thrust between himself and the rats, and he was shouting frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia! Do it to Julia, not me! Julia! I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off. Strip her to the bones. Not me. Julia, not me." He was falling backwards into enormous depths, away from the rats. He was still strapped in the chair, but he had fallen through the floor, through the walls of the building, through the earth, through the oceans, through the atmosphere, into outer space, into the gulfs between the stars, always away, away, away from the rats. He was light years distant. But O'Brien was still standing at his side. There was still the cold touch of a wire against his cheek. But through the darkness that enveloped him, he heard another metallic clink and knew that the cage had clicked shut and not open.
That's it. Oh boy. Maybe it's just me that finds it boring, but come on.
There should have been more emphasis on Winston coming to the completely illogical conclusion that the party would torture Julia instead of him. This is the whole turning point. This is what causes Julia and Winston to end their relationship, which, by the way, is done by Julia. Julia is the one that first says, "I betrayed you." Winston then simply echoes that. Julia is the one that says, "Sometimes they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, don't do it to me, do it to somebody else, do it to so-and-so. And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself." Winston just gives the thoughtful reply of repeating, "All you care about is yourself." Then Julia says, "And after that, you don't feel the same toward the other person any longer." And Winston, you get it, repeats this fact.
Remember when I was talking about that final conversation between Julia and Winston? Yeah, that's not even slightly out of place. Julia is a much better character than Winston. Not because Winston is a terrible person, though, I mean, there's that too, but because Winston is just less interesting. Let's talk about Winston's very limited character for a second. He wants freedom. Oh no, that's basically it. His character barely has a shred of life to it, and the little pieces of information we do have are inconsistent. In my original notes for this episode, I wrote, the main character eventually betrays his love interest, which was meant to be the whole goal, but how is this any sort of reveal or change? Winston was a misogynist. He had vile fantasies of harming women, and him wanting to hurt Julia was a display of him accepting Big Brother. And it seems like such a minor note, but why does the character of Winston feel so washed out? Things don't align or make sense. Even in the final interaction, Winston asks O'Brien what he wants before doing the whole "Julia, not me, Julia" thing. And Winston is a lot more flighty than that. It would be more in character for him to start begging and rambling. The final climax abolishes the very little character that was established for Winston. Now let's talk about Julia. She is also a rebel like Winston, except she actually did things about it. She was with an organization that secretly let people have sex. She was the one that initially reached out to Winston, and like I said before, she is the one that delivered the final statements about their relationship, while Winston disagreed. In every aspect, Julia is a lot more interesting than Winston. When the two have conversations, it feels like Winston rambles and Julia is funny. Winston is so dull and plain. When they finally get caught, it's Julia that's like, well, we might as well say bye, I guess, when Winston just shakes in his boots. Julia is not given a lot of building, and I'm unsure whether this is due to the fact that Winston did not truly care for Julia, or because Orwell just didn't want to spend too much time on female characters. Regardless, Julia has a fun energy that was a lot more compelling than Winston. This leads me to my biggest critique of the book, the basis of my overall review. Julia should have been the main character. Julia is the one that actually reaches out to Winston, and it is only because of her that they are able to have meetings. She does so much more than Winston, and the book would be way less boring if we heard it from her perspective. Julia's book could have started with her meeting with the other girls that know how to have secret meetings, or it could have started with her at the Minutes of Hate meeting with Winston, thinking about her crush on him. We could have seen the development and thought process that eventually led to her passing that note to Winston and why she was okay with the risk. And like I mentioned, that final conversation between Winston and Julia, it was Julia that actually articulated things. Based on her dialogue, it feels like she is perceptive, and thus experiencing characters through her eyes would be more interesting because you would get more than Winston's limited observations. The plot with O'Brien also could have been more interesting if Julia was hearing through Winston and was unable to have direct conversations with O'Brien. If she had to piece together a theory based on secondhand ideas, it would be a lot more interesting than Winston basically being in love with O'Brien. So, to summarize this all,
it has nothing to say, and it says that nothing badly.
The novel praised for being insightful does not have any profound takes at all. It's events without analysis. Furthermore, the novel is poorly written. It is boring and the characters are done horribly. The book has potential, but there were so many failings. This book would be made better simply by switching the protagonist from Winston to Julia, and it could be a lot better if Orwell tried to expand his thinking just a little. I want to sound objective, but it's difficult when a book is this disappointing. Pushing aside personal preference, my final statement would be, the book had a lot of potential. There were interesting plot points and themes. It just occasionally failed to deliver to the full extent it could have. And that brings us to our conclusion, which is 1984 is not the height of literature. It is wasted potential. So, what do you think of it? Did you ever read 1984? Does this video influence your opinion at all? How many of us claim to have read something because we think it makes us seem more educated? You read a summary or watch a video and act like you're an expert. Would your false claims change if you had Big Brother watching you? I think I've made my opinions very clear, but what about yours? I have some questions for you to think about. The first, do you agree with me that the book would be more compelling if it was told through the perspective of Julia, not Winston? Second, do you think 1984 would be considered as more insightful or less if it was published today instead of 1949? Third, how much do you feel in the relevance of it? Have you felt judged by the thought police? Have you felt the eyes of Big Brother? Do you have freedom? Truly. But don't worry too much about your answers, for this is no telescreen. I can't see you, and you can't see me.